Next up is Dr. Matthew Bowker. He is the Associate Professor in the School of Forestry at Northern Arizona University, and he is also the Associate Director of the Center for Ecosystem Science and Society. He's going to tell us about the living skin on top of desert soils. It's a biocrust formed by tiny plants and microbes that protects and enriches the soil underneath.
Thanks, Denise. Okay, so we're going to talk about biocrusts a little bit more. I'm going to talk a little bit about how they're important, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of our restoration work with these really interesting communities. So we've already used a word you may not be familiar with, biocrust, and the first thing I need to do is define it. So that's a contraction for biological soil crust. I'm going to tell you a bit more about what they are, and I just wanted to let you know that we wrote a whole paper about this, some of my friends and I from around the world. And if you want to follow up and read this, it's open access. All you have to do is Google what is a biocrust, and you'll find it. So in this paper, what we put forward is that there are 4 elements to defining a biocrust. There are certain habitat characteristics. There are characteristics of the physical structure. There are important functional characteristics. In other words, what do biocrusts do? And there are taxonomical compositional characteristics. In other words, some biota form biocrusts, but others don't. So our first one is the habitat characteristics. And this one's not going to break your brains or anything, but soil is on land. Biocrusts grow on soil. Therefore, biocrusts are on land. Okay? On the uppermost surface only, not throughout the soil profile, just the uppermost surface. So that means if you're looking at a rock, it doesn't have a soil biocrust on it. If you're looking at a plant surface like a tree trunk, there's not biocrust on that. Okay? There may be communities that are kind of like what I'm talking about, but they're not exactly the same thing. It also means soil biocrusts are not in aquatic environments, they're not in marine environments, and they're not in intertidal habitats. Okay? They grow on unambiguous land. Okay? Most of these unambiguous land habitats dry out on a regular basis. And that's also a feature of biocrust habitats. So here's a couple nice images of what biocrusts look like, and I'll shower you with more of those as this talk progresses. Second element is the particular nature of the physical structure. Okay? Now think about that word crust. How do we normally use that in just plain English? What it refers to is kind of a harder outer surface of something, right? So we can look up there, look, crusts. These are a couple kinds of crusts you're very familiar with. And it implies that the inner layer is different somehow, okay? So we're talking about here a type of crust that's on the outer surface of soils. So a biocrust is a physically cohesive, thin, hardened layer, often brittle as well, on top of the soil. It's a biocrust as opposed to a physical crust because it's engineered by organisms. Usually when you look at the literature, the things that people are referring to as biocrusts are just millimeters thick, centimeters at most, and it's a common feature that they can break under pressure because often the soil underneath the biocrust is a little bit softer and you can push right through it. Next one is the functional characteristics, and I've got a few to talk about here. One of the signature moves of a biocrust is aggregating soil particles or lumping them together. So they can take individual particles of sand, silt, clay, put them together into larger bodies. They're also photosynthetic communities, okay? So they are feeding themselves using energy from the sun. And they're also able to tolerate extreme conditions like desiccation, which we've heard about a couple times today. So what that means is where biocrusts are present, they're increasing soil stability and decreasing soil erosion. And you can really see that here. Can you see my cursor? No. You can see that in that top photo there, where there's a little shelf of soil suspended over loose sand. And it's like that because there are cyanobacteria weaving through and holding that together and making that structure. And that lower picture is showing you desiccation tolerance. Desiccation tolerance basically means that an organism can dry out without dying. It can lose all of its body water or a very large proportion of its body water, but remain alive, waiting for the next time it could be wet. And you see that in these two mosses there. That is the same species in the dry state, inactive, and in the wet state, active. Okay, the final one is taxonomic composition. In other words, what organisms make biocrusts. First thing I want to say is that when we're talking about a biocrust, we're not talking about a species, we're talking about a community of many species, okay? And they always include photosynthetic biota, ones that make their own food, but also hanging around with them are heterotrophs, like you and me, that have to go out and eat food. And these are usually microbes. The main photosynthesizers, or sorry, the photosynthesizers of biocrusts are always cryptogams, okay? So we've heard about cryptogams all morning. It's kind of cryptogam morning today. It's a weird group of not necessarily related organisms, but they all share some important properties. They're little photosynthesizers that lack roots and seeds. And you can see several groups up here, some of which you've already met this morning. So those are the photosynthetic component, and them together with their microbial heterotrophic friends are forming biocrusts. So that means you can have cyanobacterial biocrusts, you can have algal biocrusts, you can have lichen biocrusts, or you can have combinations of these things, okay? It also means that biocrusts are not made by ferns and their relatives, and biocrusts are not made by vascular plants. We don't need a special word for those because we just call those plant communities or forests or grasslands. We've got lots of words for those, but biocrusts are the ones that are making this thin soil surface community made by these cryptogams. So this is everything I just told you in one diagram. These are those 4 pillars of that definition. And what I want to communicate here is that when all of these things are true at the same time, right in the center, that's when you know you're looking at a biocrust. And that's what separates a biocrust from other communities that have some similar properties. So this ends up including a lot of variety, this definition. I'm showing you some interesting biocrusts from around the world here in different environments. We've got a couple from Germany in the upper left in really wet environments. We've got the reddish one is Australia. In the center at the top, that's semi-arid Mexico. And on the bottom, that's from southern Utah. And then over on the left are a couple from Iceland. And just for laughs, here's more. We got some more Utah, we got Spain, Mexico, and that one in the center, that's what Jim was talking about. The fire moss community is a type of biocrust that grows after forest fire, and it's mostly engineered by mosses. So we find these biocrusts all over the world. Here's a map published recently that depicts where biocrusts are expected to occur, and the dots are showing where biocrust studies have actually been published from. In general, the habitats you tend to find them, or where they're most well documented, are dry lands, okay, so water-limited environments. But you can also go to cold-limited regions, high latitudes, high altitudes, find biocrusts there. And you can also find them in disturbed mesic regions, wetter environments that normally would have plants, but because of a disturbance, there's an open niche for biocrusts. As a matter of fact, you can walk out those double doors, and there's some open ground out there with biocrusts. Okay. So this is tiny taxa doing big things today. So those, I told you about the tiny taxa. Now let's talk about the big things that they do. Some of them we've heard about in other contexts, but I'll try to provide a little new information. I'm going to talk about 4 things that biocrusts do, among many others. And we'll start with what I described earlier as the signature move, aggregating soil. So all biocrusts do this. They bind soil particles together. This is a scanning electron micrograph of that happening. The stringy stuff that you see are cyanobacterial filaments, and you can see they're kind of like roping together soil particles, kind of creating a net around them, and just binding it all together into a cohesive aggregate. And this creates stability of the soil surface. And this is really important because if you have stable soils, then you're not going to have major erosion events like this dust storm predicted here, where you've got the soil blowing and then lifting up 1,000 feet into the sky. In fact, biocrusts are so good at this that it was recently estimated that if you were to erase, if you took a magic wand and erased all the biocrusts of the Earth, there would be about 60% more dust blowing around the globe. So they're having a major effect on the Earth system, really. Next one I want to talk about is hydrology and soil water. This one's complicated, but one general thing I can say is that biocrusts regulate most things related to soil water. But they do different things in different places. Not all biocrusts have the same hydrological function. So in some environments, they have a bumpy texture, and that bumpy texture, when it rains really hard, it kind of baffles and slows down water runoff and helps the water find a pathway into the soil. So they can help water soak in those environments. In other environments, they do the exact opposite. They actually shuttle the water elsewhere and prevent it from soaking in. And a good example of this is actually on the Great Wall of China, which you may not realize a big proportion of that is made out of soil. It's made out of rammed earth, and then biocrusts are actually colonizing on that, and they're keeping water out of it and preventing water damage and preserving the Great Wall of China. A couple other things related to water. I really like this one. They're excellent capturers of fog and dew. And this is really neat because it's like bonus water for the ecosystem. Most ecosystems run off of regular precipitation like rain and snow, but if you've got fog and dew and something can grab onto it, that's extra activity, extra productivity. So this is an image here of a biocrust moss, and you see those white hairs coming off of it. Those are called awns, and they are excellent fog nucleators. So droplets will grab onto that and get bigger and bigger, coalescing, and then they'll drip down to the moss and the soil below, adding a pulse of activity. It's really cool. Another thing commonly demonstrated around the world is that biocrusts tend to be a little bit wetter than soils that lack biocrusts, but only near the surface. So this is some data demonstrating that. This comes from China, and this is a 3-month period in which soil moisture was monitored. The blue line is the soil right under biocrusts, and the gray line is soil lacking biocrusts. And you can see for that, pretty much that entire period, the biocrusts were a little bit wetter. Okay, fertilizing soil. Now we're going to test, if you were paying attention earlier. If I said, if you were at your favorite pub quiz, and I said, the most frequently limiting soil nutrient is I heard of phosphorus, that's a good guess too, but nitrogen is the answer. What's the problem with nitrogen? Lack of bioavailability, yeah. Yeah, and why is it biounavailable?
Most of it is atmospheric.
That's exactly right, most of it is atmospheric. So nitrogen limits many, many ecosystems around the world on land, and the problem with it is most of the nitrogen's in the atmosphere, and most of the Earth's nitrogen is in the atmosphere, and most of the atmosphere is nitrogen. So we're breathing it right now, but we're not benefiting from it. We have to go eat protein to get our nitrogen. The nitrogen we're breathing is just coming in and out and not doing anything for us biochemically. Okay? But there's a solution, a biological solution, we've already heard a little bit about this morning, and that's this process of nitrogen fixation. And biocrusts are contributing to this, and this is one of the several ways that they build soil fertility. So this, again, is that process where you've got the N2 gas in the atmosphere. That is not a nutrient. And certain organisms have a special enzyme that can grab that, and then they can conduct some amazing biochemical presto changeo, and then turn it into ammonium, which is a nutrient. So not just any biota can do this. This is a special trick of just some bacteria, and some of those live in biocrusts. The notable contributors really are cyanobacteria. They're not the only ones that do this, but cyanobacteria are major contributors, either free living, off on their own, or some of them are the green partner in the lichens that we heard about from Rike earlier, and some of them are growing actually on the surfaces of mosses too. But most biocrusts around the world are fixing some nitrogen to some degree. Because biocrusts are expected to be, or modeled to be covering about 12% of the Earth, and because they have this capability, it's been estimated recently that they are fixing 25% of the nitrogen that is fixed on land. So that's a pretty big number. Last one I want to talk about is their interactions with other biota. So they are kind of shaping the habitat for other things like microbes and plants and animals. I'll focus on plants today. They can really shape the composition of plant communities, and this is because of ways that they alter the habitat. So one example is the presence of biocrusts can alter the emergence success. So when a seed is trying to germinate and then push through the soil and grow up into a little seedling, a biocrust is somewhat of a barrier that it has to get beyond. And some plants do this quite well, and other plants not so well. So it's kind of like a seesaw that's going to tip the community one way or the other. Similarly, biocrusts, as I said before, they accumulate and maintain soil fertility. So this can be very, very influential for a growing seedling. If it grows in a biocrust, it has a good nutrient supply. And another thing I mentioned earlier was their effects on soil moisture. They increase soil moisture, but only near the surface. So they're changing the depth profile of soil moisture. So all these things together are going to lead to distinct plant communities in and near biocrusts compared to nearby areas that lack biocrusts. So one good example of this was from a study I recently participated in, where we found that soil surfaces with more biocrust supported communities with a greater proportion of native plants as opposed to exotic plants. So, these are pretty big things, right? They seem pretty important. You may wonder, what can't biocrusts do? One thing they're not so good at is resisting disturbances. So here we might be talking about the physical disruption and hoof action associated with grazing and ranching, or it might be the heat from a wildfire, or it might be the construction and land disturbance activities associated with energy development. Okay? they're not so good at dealing with that. And when you have these kind of forces active in a location, you can lose a large proportion of the biocrust very fast in seconds or minutes. But then for them to spontaneously come back will definitely take years, maybe decades, and maybe even longer. So there's a real mismatch between the loss and the regain, which leads us pretty well into part 3. What can we do about it? So among other hats that I wear, I'm a restoration ecologist, so I'm really interested in ways to bring back biocrusts. And our basic game plan is on this slide here. The idea is grow the biocrust organisms, add them back where they've been lost, and then encourage their recovery so they can go forth and do good things in the ecosystems where they live. So I'll just give you a quick tour of some of this kind of research. There's groups around the world working on this problem. So in terms of growing biocrusts, there are definitely ways to do it. One approach is to go into a biocrust and try to isolate a strain of cyanobacteria that can be grown and grown separately from the rest of the community. And if you do this, if you isolate it, you can keep it in culture for a long period of time. And this can be upscaled to bioreactors and even these big ponds like this one. And you can grow large quantities in basically a nutrient broth. So this is a technique that's been employed. Another approach, instead of taking the community apart and growing organisms one by one, you can just try to grow the whole community, basically in a farm. And you need to get a little bit of material from natural biocrusts, and you can set up irrigated beds and grow out biocrusts, and it actually works quite well. And you get a lot of community members that way. This is a new idea, just came out in a paper this year. What if photovoltaic solar farms are biocrust production facilities? So the researchers that wrote this paper happened to notice that there was spontaneous natural colonization of biocrusts on the soil underneath the shade of solar panels. So they wondered, well, what if we harvested from that and then managed it in such a way that it grew back and we just used it as a low effort farm? So that's the idea that they're putting forward. And then this one is one that was developed in my group. This one we're specifically using for biocrust mosses. So we can grow moss basically just on using fog. We don't even need soil, we just grow them on cloth. And because they're so good at grabbing that fog with those little hairs, they grow wonderfully in this environment. And within a couple months, we can pull out sheets of basically moss lawns like Jasmine is holding there. So about 2 months to do that. So that's some examples of growing biocrusts. There's different approaches. It can be done. Establishing them in the field is one of these things that's easier said than done because we've got degraded field sites that might have a harsh environment. The organisms that you grew, they may have lost their field hardiness. And then you also lose a lot of material to wind and water and even ants. We've seen many times ants stealing our biocrust. So we need solutions for that too. And this is a really challenging part of this. But we have cool ideas that have been shown to be promising. Here's Kyle Doherty, and he invented moss cloth. And the idea is we use that cloth, that fog chamber, and grow moss over a piece of burlap. And then you can put that cloth, moss side down, attach it to a soil, and then in about a year, you've got a patch of moss crust. So this worked quite well. A related idea, a little bit similar but bigger, are sods. We're actually growing biocrust sods now. Way over on the left-hand side, that's our sod farm in Scottsdale, Arizona. And I'm going to start a video now of our crew cutting and rolling sods to be transported out in the field. And as that's playing, you can watch me finish rolling a sod out. So basically, we've got a organic cloth overlain by some soil, overlain by biocrust that we grew, and you can roll out big pieces of this to create kind of a biocrust island. And we're testing this not only in Arizona, but in 3 locations in California in the Mojave Desert. These are going in like right now. Let's say you want to do something more dispersed. Instead of do something intense in a small area, you want to spread biocrust everywhere. Like I said, ants will just steal it if you don't protect them. So one way we've come up with to protect them is to embed the crust that we grow in little clay balls. Okay, so this is the same idea as seed pellets or seed balls, just little ones. Okay, and what we found is that if we do this, we can establish a mossy biocrust in about 18 months. And the reason this is a good idea is because the clay is going to protect the organisms from the elements, it's going to protect them from herbivores, and it's going to be kind of like a time release, because the clay is only going to dissolve when it's raining and snowing. In other words, when the mosses really want to establish. Okay, so I'll sum up now. We find biocrusts around the world. They do big things that help ecosystems work. They're easily lost due to land use decisions that we make, but research to bring them back is underway, and although it's not easy, I'm an optimistic guy, and I think we'll find a really good path to do this eventually. So I'd like to thank the garden and the organizers for this great event, and all of you for listening. And I also want to thank my funders and my team that does all the stuff, and all my great collaborators. So thank you for listening. Yes, right over there.
I'm wondering, when you do your restoration and you're making little moss sods or carpets, how are you drawing in the other components of crust?
How am I doing what?
Like, I see the moss in the restoration, but how are you going to get the other components?
Oh, okay. Yes, the question was, when we're using these restoration techniques, how do you get the other components of the biocrusts? It depends on the environment, which organisms you really need to get back. Some of the environments where we're working, kind of the anchor is the moss. So we're fairly content with that. We're putting out a biocrust dominant organism. The sods example is a little bit different, because there we're growing a mixture of mosses, lichens, and cyanobacteria. So the sod is actually the whole deal. Oh, so many at the same time. I think the woman here in front of Bill.
Okay, so have you got legislation so that if people are destroying the crusts, that they have to punish them?
So the question was, is there legislation dictating restoration of crusts if they're destroyed? No.
Did you explain to them how these big beams and things are
I couldn't quite hear you. Could you say that again, please?
You know the big dust storms that
Yes.
happen around Phoenix? Aren't those caused by that?
Yes. So, yeah, one of the dustiest places in our country is in Arizona, and there's an area in between Tucson and Phoenix, and it's kind of a mosaic of agricultural land. A good portion of it's disused or abandoned, and it's unvegetated, uncrusted, and without that, we have a real air quality. Without something holding the soil down, we have a real air quality problem. So there ought to be a law, but there isn't. So we haven't tracked these really long-term yet, but the idea is that they would decompose. It's an organic cloth on the bottom. One variation is a weed-blocking cloth, because we may want that in some places, and another variation is a plant-permeable cloth. But in both cases, they're organic, and they're intended to eventually rot within a few seasons.